What's up, everyone? This is Dreas. I'm here at Bean Hollow State Beach on the beautiful California coast. Today we're going to be hopping in some tide pools. We're going to learn what causes the tides. We're going to learn what are the different sections of the tide pool and what sort of adaptations do the creatures have to survive in this habitat. Let's start with the Earth. Our planet is surrounded by a thin layer of liquid water called the ocean. The next nearest object in our solar system is the Moon, which exerts a gravitational force in our ocean, pulling it towards it. The part of the ocean that's on the opposite side of the Earth from the Moon feels less of the Moon's gravitational force, and so it relaxes away from the Moon. So, an observer standing at point A would observe the tide as being relatively low, whereas an observer at point B would observe the tide as being relatively high. This pattern continues as the Moon rotates around the Earth, pulling the water on the closest side towards it, while the water furthest from the Moon relaxes away from the Moon. If you were standing at point A, what would the tide be, high or low? What about point B? What do you think? Would the tide be high or low? Pause the video while you think about the answer. If you said high tide for point A, you are correct, and for point B, that would be low tide. The last part of the equation is the Sun, which also exerts a gravitational pull on the oceans of the Earth. When the Moon and the Sun form a right angle with the Earth, their gravitational forces sort of cancel each other out. In this case, an observer standing at point A or B would see the tide go up and down, still following the Moon, but the change is a lot less dramatic than during other times. This is what happens when the Moon is half full, so it's not a really good time to go tide pooling because you don't get a very dramatic low tide. The best time of the month to go tide pooling is when the Sun, Earth, and Moon all form a straight line. This is what happens during the full moon and the new moon. This time, an observer at point A would see the tide as being very low, while an observer at point B would see the tide as being very high. These drawings are not to scale, but they give you an idea of what's going on. Before you go tide pooling, check the moon and the tides. This time it was a new moon, so I knew the tide would be very low. I checked the tide and sure enough, had a nice negative tide in the afternoon. Perfect for tide pooling. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna head all the way out to the water's edge. The tide is almost low, and once it reaches that low point, it's gonna start coming up again. So we're gonna start in the area that's furthest down into the ocean, and as the tide comes up, we'll be working our way back towards the land. We will begin our investigation in an area called the low zone. This area is usually covered by water and is only exposed during very low tides like the one we have today. So here we are, pretty close to the water's edge. Found a cool spot where we can check out the low zone. So this is an area that spends most of its time under the water. As you can see, even at low tide, the creatures that live down there are mostly covered in water. So we have some larger anemone, several different types of algae, this is also a good place to find sea stars. All it needs is some green swim trunks, so we got Patrick right here. So I'm not gonna try to lift it up, I'm not gonna try to disturb it too much, but I'm just gonna give it a gentle touch, and I can really feel that it has this really tough skin. That's gonna help it survive in this environment because it has to deal with predators not only from the ocean, but also from the land. Down here in the low zone, we see a lot of these urchins. You might also notice that they've made this circular pattern that's pretty clear right here. This is where they are excavating the rock beneath them in order to make a home. All right, so we're gonna say goodbye to the low zone down there at the water's edge and step up into the mid zone. This area is also covered by water a lot of the time, but it is also exposed a lot of the time as well. So here we have a mid-zone tide pool. We have more of our urchins and anemones, but we'll see they're a little bit on the smaller side. Again, these are creatures that depend on water. So when they're up here and they're exposed a little more often, they're more pressed for resources, so they don't tend to grow as big. The species of algae we see up here are also smaller, and they tend to form a hard crust instead of the smooth, slippery forms that we saw down in the low zone. And this protects them from drying out. Next up, we have the high zone. This area spends most of the time out of the water, but it does get covered by water during high tides, like we will have later today. As we move up into the high zone, we see that this area is dominated by fields of mussels. Very common tide pool species. The California mussel right here, this darker one with a black or almost purple shell. And in and amongst them, we have the gooseneck barnacle. When these creatures are underwater, they have feeding mechanisms that they put out into the water column to filter through the water to absorb food. Otherwise, they're exposed to the air, and they have this really hard shell that protects them from drying out. The last zone we will explore is the splash zone. As its name implies, this area mostly gets wet by splashing water rather than being completely covered by waves. So we've moved away from the water's edge. We're now up here in the splash zone. The lower part of the splash zone has a lot of snails, and as we move up, it transitions to be more of these barnacles. Barnacles and limpets. That's the splash zone. Alright, so we covered all the zones. Now we're gonna go on a free-for-all and see if we can find some cool creatures out here. Down here we even found an abalone shell. So that's pretty cool. Here we have a sea star that's probably enjoying a nice meal. The sea star is the top predator of these mussels. They have these really strong tube feet on the bottom of them that are able to rip open the shell of the mussel so that they can get into the meat that's inside of there. Look! Teeny tiniest anemone next to slightly bigger anemone. That's awesome. Alright, that concludes our tide pool adventure. I hope you enjoyed checking out some of these tide pool creatures and learning a bit about the tides and the different creatures that live here in the tide pools. One thing that I think is really cool about tide pools is how you have so many different types of creatures living relatively close to one another. So ordinarily, when you might have to drive 100 miles to find a different type of environment, here you have all these different environments coming together right here in the tide pools. If you live here in the Bay Area or on the coast of California, I'll post in a sec whichever tide pools are closest to each county. Hopefully you can check them out with your friends or family. Usually less than an hour drive away, so very cool. I hope everyone has a great day.